Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing super well. Thank you all so much for being here for today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the life of Dominique Dunne and how she was starting to make a name for herself as an actress in Hollywood until unfortunately at only 22 years old, her boyfriend ended her life. Dominique was much more than an actress though. She was a daughter, a beloved sister, a friend. There are so many articles and interviews to read and watch about Dominique's life, which I reference while writing today's video. However, one of the most personal accounts comes from her brother, Griffin, who wrote a family memoir titled The Friday Afternoon Club that just really brought Dominique to life in a different light. I listened to the audiobook, which he narrates himself, and it was just so powerful to listen to and just an absolute pleasure to listen to. Griffin really dives deep into his family, him and his siblings' upbringing, and into Dominique's death, which is where I gathered a lot of insight for today's video. I will have that link down below. I mean, I highly recommend that you guys go read or listen to it after this video. I also referenced her dad, Dominique's Vanity Fair article called Justice, a Father's Account of the Trial of His Daughter's Killer, which is quite a long read, but it also just revealed a lot of what was going on behind the scenes for the Dunne family after Dominique's death. Her family went on to spread awareness about domestic violence and legal injustices, and on behalf of us here in La Familia, I will be making a donation to the organization Dominique's mother made in her honor called Justice for Homicide Victims, which works to make changes in legislation and provide support to families coping with the loss of a loved one to violence. JHV also helps families navigate the difficult and confusing legal system, which is a challenge the Dunnes know all too well. All that being said, thank you all so much for being here and for also sending me Dominique's case. This was actually very highly requested after the Menendez video that I did, because if you guys did end up watching Monsters on Netflix, Dominique's dad, Dominic, was played in the show. So I feel like because of that, a lot of people became aware of what happened to Dominique. And because of that, a lot of people just started sending me her case and were like, can you please do a deep dive into this? So here we are today. It's going to be a very long video. But again, thank you all just so much for being here. Before we get into the video, I do just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Blueland, who helps support this channel. The holiday season is here, and I don't know about you guys, but around the holidays, I always get so overwhelmed by the amount of trash that I accumulate. With all the holiday parties, gift wrapping, I mean, there's just so much trash that I feel horrible about throwing away, but that is why I am so happy that I found Blueland this year. Blueland products have no plastic waste, only compostable or recyclable packaging, meaning they are people and planet friendly. They don't use any single-use plastic in any component, from bottles, tablets, and wrappers to shipping, which is great because I do use tablets to clean my dishwasher and washing machine, and those can be really wasteful, but Blueland's tablets are fully compostable. Not only are they planet friendly, but Blueland's products are also effective and affordable. Their dishwasher tablets are proven to perform on baked on, burnt on stains. There's no rinse aid needed. As for their laundry tablets, those have proven to lift the toughest stains, ranging from grass stains to food stains. Blueland also offers toilet tablets, which if you're hosting a holiday party anytime soon, you are definitely going to have to try those. Their holiday hand soap gift set is so cute. When I opened the package, I felt as if I was opening a box of chocolates. They have so many holiday scents. I use a peppermint tablet and I just love how it smells like Christmas. They have 12 scents you can choose from, and I think this gift set is perfect for yourself, for Secret Santa, or for any loved one. So that you never run out of your most used products, Blueland offers a customized subscription service to refill your products, or you can get even more savings by buying refills in bulk. I've been loving my Blueland products and I know that you will too. Blueland is sharing a special offer just for my viewers. All you have to do is click the link down below to get 15% off your first kit. Once again, thank you so much to Blueland for supporting this channel, and with that, let's jump right into today's video. Dominique Ellen Dunne was born on November 23rd, 1959 to her parents Ellen Beatrice Griffin and Dominique Dunne in Santa Monica, California. To better understand Dominique's life, I think it's important we discuss her family as well. Her parents are very well-known figures, so let's talk about them for a bit. Her father, Dominique Dunne, was born in 1925 into a well-off Irish Catholic family in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was the second oldest of 6 children. His father was a heart surgeon and president of a hospital, so his family was pretty well off. Even though his dad was literally a surgeon and they had a lot of money, his family still wasn't really accepted into high society. Dominic said, quote, "Although we belonged to WASP clubs, we were never a part of things. We were like minor league Kennedys." He says his childhood was a bit tough since he apparently could never live up to his father's standards, saying, "I liked puppet shows and I was kind of a sissy. Something about me drove my father crazy. He mocked me and often often beat me with a wooden coat hanger. He says his father also beat him with straps and riding crops, which left welts on his legs and thighs, and he says that he even had a blow to his ear in the 5th grade that left him partially deaf. He was just a bit different than his siblings. For example, Dominic would put up photos of his favorite movie stars on his side of his shared bedroom, while his brother would put up like sports trophies and football pennants and things like that. Dominic said, "I never once made a team and it humiliated my father. I was always putting on puppet shows in the basement. I was from the time that I was a little kid interested in theater. I just had this sense of glamour. I understood it when I was 4. I imagine that was just so incredibly hard for him, to love Hollywood and to love the theater so much that you actually can't fully enjoy it because it disappoints your father. Later, Dominic was drafted into the army during his senior year of high school, and he went to basic training camp. He went overseas and went on to earn a Bronze Star in Felsberg, Germany in 1944 for courageously helping 2 wounded soldiers with another fellow soldier despite being ordered to retreat from battle. Dominic says that this was sort of like the turning point in his life after growing up not very athletic, so he felt very proud of what he did. After serving, Dominic went to Williams College in Massachusetts, and all of the Dunns went on to attend prestigious schools. His older brother Richard attended Harvard, his brother John Gregory went to Princeton, his younger brother went to Georgetown and Yale Graduate School. I mean, there was a lot of pressure when it came to this family. Just imagine growing up in a family where all of your siblings go to like elite prestigious schools, and then it's up to you to also follow in that tradition. So there was a lot of pressure within the Dunn family, and during Dominic's freshman year, his father actually passed away due to a heart attack. He unfortunately says that he and his father never really sat down to talk through their relationship or kind of work through any of their unresolved issues. After graduating from college, Dominic moved to New York, where he worked as a stage manager for a TV show called The Howdy Doody Show, which was a very popular children's show at the time. He went on to be the stage manager for other shows and was beginning his career in the industry. Around the same time, while getting off a train in Hartford, Connecticut, he saw a woman who caught his attention immediately. He was just stunned by her beauty. He said that she was ravishing. This woman was Ellen Beatrice Griffin. Ellen, also known as Lenny with her friends, was an only child born in 1932, and she came from a very wealthy ranching family in Arizona. Her father was Irish and her mother was Mexican. Her father owned this like 30,000 acre cattle ranch in Nogales, Arizona, and things went incredibly well for them. Ellen was actually the heiress to this ranch. Her ancestors founded the empire called the Griffin Wheel Company, whose wheels were on every single train in America. So her family had a lot of fortune. Ellen and Dominic met, and then they married in 1954 at her family's ranch. It was this large wedding, and it was a very happy day for everyone. They went on to their honeymoon, and then upon their return, they lived in New York for some time before moving to California, where Dominic would continue making a name for himself, and he actually went on to become executive producer of a series called Adventures in Paradise. So things were going really well for the Dunns. Dominic and Ellen went on to have 2 sons, Griffin and Alex, and they did get pregnant twice with girls. But unfortunately, their daughters sadly didn't make it. One baby was actually stillborn, and the other baby died shortly after birth, only living for 24 hours. It's incredibly sad that this happened to the family. I mean, Ellen just really wanted a daughter. A year after the death of their 2 daughters, the Dunn family moved from Santa Monica to Beverly Hills, where Dominic was working as vice president of 4-Star Television. In November of 1959, Ellen got pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Dominique. Griffin says that he remembers he and Alex first seeing their baby sister from the top of the stairs when their mom came home with Dominique sleeping in her arms. Ellen told them to come downstairs to say hi to their new baby sister, and she placed Dominique on her lap, and Griffin and Alex gently touched her head and said hi to their new sister, and they both gave her a kiss on her forehead. The whole family was just so happy with the birth of Dominique, especially Ellen. She finally had her daughter. Having Dominique was a precious gift to the Dunn family, and they just felt truly blessed. They gave her all the love in the world. Growing up, Dominique had a great sense of humor and was very confident. She knew what she wanted and wasn't going to allow anyone to tell her who she was or what she wanted. Only she could do that. Everyone says she was a little bit stubborn, but like in a good way, her family says. In Griffin's family memoir, he wrote about how she would sometimes boss around him and Alex. So she was just like very headstrong, but had a very soft heart. She was very kind to everyone and didn't feel like she was superior to anyone. She made sure to show the utmost respect for everyone regardless of their job title or status. That kind of kindness extended to animals as well. When she got a little bit older, she couldn't bear to see any stray animals animals on the street, and she would always be bringing home cats or dogs to take care of them. So sometimes the Dunn house was like filled with animals at random times. Sometimes these animals were like sick or had like unusual conditions, but Dominique didn't care. She loved all of them, and she just couldn't bear to look the other way if she saw an animal in need. Dominique was loved so much by her parents, by her friends, and by all her aunts and uncles. She was just an absolute delight to her family and to everyone that she met. The three children grew up in the company of famous faces of LA's movie executives, actors, actresses, etc. Given Dominique's work and the fact that Dominique and Ellen were becoming very well-known names, and they frequently hosted and attended house parties with a very impressive guest list. In Chapter 8 of Griffin's family memoir, he recalls how these gatherings felt like a blend of excitement and normalcy, saying, quote, "If the party was larger and fell on a school night, a nanny would check my brother, sister, and me into a hotel in our pajamas, each carrying homework and an overnight bag." Although there were always these extravagant parties, Dominic felt kind of out of place. He felt that his work as a producer ranked him lower than these actors and actresses and like A-list Hollywood people that he was surrounded with. He wanted to belong. Dominic said, quote, "My jobs never qualified me for the strata of Hollywood we moved in. I always kept scrapbooks and saved everything. On some level, I knew it was not going to last." Unfortunately, his premonition did come true and things began to change. In 1956, his wife Ellen asked for a divorce. Ellen was no longer interested in the social climbing or parties or being on this person's list or meeting this person, etc. She just felt like that wasn't her thing anymore, and they separated, and in 1969, they finalized their divorce. The end of their marriage had really marked a turning point for Dominic. He began to reevaluate his life and priorities, realizing how much of his identity had been tied to the glamorous world of Hollywood and its social scene. He then began struggling with drugs and alcoholism and felt like everything just kept spiraling downward. In a Vanity Fair article from 2008, Dominic wrote, quote, "I had begun to fall apart. Drink and drugs. Lenny divorced me. I was arrested getting off a plane from Acapulco carrying grass and was put in jail." So obviously things were not going well in Dominic's life, and his brother John Gregory and his wife Joan, who went on to become very famous writers, I'm sure most of you have heard of them, actually bailed him out of jail, and they lent him $10,000 to get back on his feet. Dominic says that this time was just terrible. None of the movies he was producing were making any noise, and to make matters worse, he had made this drunken joke about a powerful agent in Hollywood that was actually published in the newspaper, which he felt marked the end of his career. After that, he somewhat became kind of like an outcast in the industry and was struggling terribly financially. It was all just very hard for him. I mean, his lifelong dream of making it in Hollywood and working on films was gone. Dominic knew he had to make a change and was determined to find a new sense of purpose, one with genuine connections and creativity rather than just focusing on social status and having these big Hollywood parties. So in 1975, Dominic left Los Angeles. His daughter, Dominique, helped him organize a yard sale alongside her friend and artist, Norman Carby. They helped Dominic sell basically all of his belongings, and they even sold his dog, which like really hurt him. Dominic said that after this yard sale, he got into his car. He didn't know where he was headed. He ended up just driving north until he stopped for a flat tire in Oregon and stayed there in a one-room cabin for 6 months. Here, he was trying to overcome his challenges with no telephone or television. Only his children knew how to reach him, which was through letters. He dabbled in some writing during this time and thought that this could be his new career. He was actually commissioned to write the sequel to the novel The Users, written by Joyce Haber, who was a former LA Times gossip columnist who was unwell and unable to write the well-awaited sequel. So Dominic was like, okay, perfect, I'll write the sequel, and he was doing that in the cabin until he unfortunately got terrible news. His brother, Stefan, unfortunately took his own life, something Dominic said that he was actually contemplating doing as well during his time in this cabin. So Dominic left Oregon and went to the funeral in Connecticut, and there he says he reconnected with his children and went back to Los Angeles. He kind of gathered himself, just kind of took a minute to rethink what his next move would be, and he decided to relocate to New York City with almost nothing and no money. He got this very tiny studio apartment. He sat down, he finished the sequel he was working on in Oregon titled The Winners Part 2 of Joyce Haber's The Users, and unfortunately when he published it, it was pretty much a flop. It didn't perform well at all, and Dominic felt defeated. Griffin later reflected on this time period in his dad's life when he was in his 20s, saying it was really weird because like Griffin's career was starting to set off in Hollywood and he was getting all of these roles while his father's career in Hollywood was basically ending. So that's a little bit about Dominique's Dominique's parents about their careers and their roles in Hollywood. Now, let's talk about what Dominique's early life was like. Like Griffin and Alex, Dominique attended prestigious schools including Westlake School in Los Angeles, then she went to a school in Connecticut, then she went to Fountain Valley High School in Colorado, where she really grew an interest in acting. After high school, she spent a year in Florence, Italy studying Italian, but returned home when her mom was unfortunately diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. This changed Ellen's life, and she slowly progressed from using a cane to a walker to a wheelchair until they actually had to let go of their childhood home on Waldron Drive to move to a more accommodating home since she eventually was just confined to her bedroom. I just can't imagine how difficult this must have been for Ellen. I mean, she had already suffered so much with her pregnancies and with the grief of losing her two daughters, and now with this diagnosis. Dominique was also very sad to give up her childhood home, but nonetheless, she knew it was for the best. In the fall of 1978, Dominique enrolled at Colorado State University to study drama. Her classmate, Kent Adams, noted how she stood out and how good of a performer she truly was. She was just a complete natural. A year later, she went back to Los Angeles and continued pursuing acting. She was determined to become a famous actress and just make a career off her passion. However, her brother Griffin, who I mentioned was trying to pursue acting, wasn't actually having a good time at this specific time. He was really struggling to land roles, and he just felt like Hollywood was really difficult to manage. So when his sister Dominique told him that she was going to go move to Los Angeles and try to become an actress, Griffin was like, wait, why do you want to do that? Like, I'm literally struggling myself. This is a very difficult field to be in, and he kind of just tried to warn Dominique. Griffin meant well with this. You know, he was only trying to protect his sister from disappointment. It's not like he was doing it because he was jealous of his sister and was like, oh, she's trying to copy me by also being an actor. It was nothing like that. He just wanted to kind of warn her about how difficult this would be, but Dominique did end up taking this a wrong way. They kind of argued for a bit until they eventually calmed down and apologized to each other. Griffin ultimately changed his perspective and started to encourage Dominique and told her that she would be an amazing actress, and Dominique even joked about how one day they could be like a famous brother and sister act. A friend of Griffin named Charlie Wessler, who later went on to produce Dumb and Dumber, helped connect Dominique with a director named Tony Howard. Tony was just like very impressed by her talent, and he introduced her to Nicole David, a very well-known talent agent who began sending Dominique on auditions. This was just such an exciting time for her. I mean, this is what she wanted more than anything. Her dreams were finally coming true because she quickly landed her first job within just a couple of weeks. She enrolled in the Milton Katselas Acting School at the Zephyr Theater in Los Angeles, where she attended classes twice a week for 4 hours and received a lot of praise for her dedication and talent. Some alumni from the school include George Clooney, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Jenna Elfman. So after Dominique's classes on Fridays, she and her other fellow actors and actress friends would go back to her house to hang out, party, and just have a good time. And because this kind of became like a Friday routine, they began calling themselves the Friday Afternoon Club, which is why Griffin named his family memoir after that. So Dominique's acting career was going incredibly well. She appeared in various TV shows and films, just to name a few, like The Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker, Lou Grant, Family, Heart to Heart, Fame, Breaking Away, and The Shadow Writers. But her big breakthrough was landing a role in the very well-known horror film called Poltergeist from Steven Spielberg. This movie just became so huge. I'm sure so many of you guys are familiar with this movie, and this was just her dream role. Everything seemed to be going great for Dominique. That was until in 1981, when she was just 22 years old, she met a man who at first brought her even more joy, until he started showing her his true colors. In Griffin's memoir, he writes about the time Dominique met this man named John Thomas Sweeney. Dominique was out for lunch one day with her Aunt Joan and Uncle John at this restaurant called Mon Maison, which was a very popular and prestigious restaurant at the time, when she came face to face with John Sweeney. Her Aunt Joan and Uncle John had gotten up from the table to go socialize with other people who were also there, and Dominique noticed a man was staring at her. A large bearded man in an apron who wasn't terrible looking. It was John. He approached Dominique asking her how she liked her food, and Dominique loved her meal. John told her, "Well, I cooked it, so that makes me very happy," which Griffin says was the first of many lies he told his sister. John wasn't even the chef at this restaurant. He was actually the sous chef working for Wolfgang Puck, which is a chef I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So John was kind of like in charge of prepping the food for Wolfgang to actually make, and he was now just lying to Dominique and taking credit for her food. John did eventually end up becoming the head chef, but regardless, he was still lying to Dominique. After their first interaction, it didn't take long for Dominique and John to start a romantic relationship. relationship. So who was John? He was 26 years old, which was 4 years older than Dominique, and he came from a completely different background. He grew up in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. He was the oldest of 6 children, and his father had a terrible drinking problem, which would lead to him beating John's mom and sometimes even him and his siblings if they intervened, making things even worse. John's home life and upbringing were far from pleasant, which left him with a lot of built-up anger. He was determined to leave that small town behind, so he began studying culinary arts at a local community college. After graduating, he got a job at a restaurant called Carmen's. John also took up various hobbies as a way to channel his anger, such as karate, self-defense, and painting. But it still wasn't enough for him. He just really wanted to leave Pennsylvania behind him, so he decided to relocate to California. He distanced himself from his entire family, and he began working in LA at the very prestigious Mont Maison, which, like I mentioned earlier, was the place to be at the time. Lots of celebrities were frequent clients. The restaurant was just very intent on preserving its exclusive image that they actually kept their phone number unlisted to keep out the general public. Now, according to coworkers, John was temperamental. Of course, working in a restaurant can be extremely stressful at times. I mean, if you have ever worked in the back of the house or in the front of the house, you know how chaotic things can be. So, there's bound to be occasional arguments between the cooks and the back of the house staff, but they say that John just took it a step too far sometimes. It wasn't just like regular disagreements between staff, he would just go overboard, but despite his attitude, everyone says that he was overall a good cook. In fact, the owner, Patrick Terrell, sent him on an all-expense-paid education under a respected chef in France before he became the head chef of the restaurant. After his time in France, he returned to LA and he continued working at Mont Maison, which brings us back to his and Dominique's relationship. The two had a lot of common right off the bat. Dominique spent a year in Italy and John spent some time in France, so they bonded over that. They also bonded over their love for food. Griffin says that Dominique was a foodie, like she just loved to eat, and since John was a cook, they really bonded over that. After only a few weeks of dating, they moved in together to a home on Rangeley Avenue in West Hollywood. Her friend, Charlie Wesler, said that after only meeting John twice, he already had a bad feeling about him. He said, quote, "It's never happened to me before, and it hasn't happened since that I've shaken somebody's hand and felt sort of sick." Once during an outing at a restaurant, John ordered a bottle of Dom Perignon, and before finishing that one, he ordered another one. Charlie said he was thinking like, wow, we're all kind of just starting in our careers. We don't really have any money to be buying these expensive bottles. Charlie thought that maybe John was trying to live up to Dominique's standard, trying to become part of her world, which was a complete opposite of what he grew up in. Again, Dominique came from a very wealthy family, and I mean, she was literally the niece of Joan Didion and John Donne, and was completely surrounded by important figures. As for John, he never really experienced any of that. To a lot of people, they felt like John saw Dominique as his way into that world. Charlie wasn't the only one with this gut feeling that something was just off about John. Griffin recalls how he also noticed this when he first met John. He and Dominique went to New York and they went to a rough cut screening of a movie Griffin co-produced called Baby It's You, which ironically was about a wealthy girl falling for a working class boy who eventually outgrows him, and that sends a boy into a violent rage. There, John told Griffin, "Sir, that was me," referring to the troubled working class kid from the movie. Griffin was like, okay, why is he calling me sir? I'm not that much older than him. Why is he trying to suck up to me? And second, what kind of comment is that? I mean, his sister's boyfriend was comparing himself to a violent character who lashed out after his wealthy girlfriend broke up with him. It was just really weird to compare himself to that. Griffin said that he felt this was John's way of telling him he too thought he was with a girl he couldn't keep up with and was also capable of violence if he lost her, or if he lost his chance at a privileged Hollywood life. In chapter 21 of his family memoir, Griffin wrote, quote, "Sweeney was telling me that Dominique's privileged upbringing and ambition to be an actress threatened him to a point where he might one day be a threat to her, but I wasn't listening." During that same New York trip while at a restaurant/bar, someone actually recognized Dominique from Poltergeist while John went to the bathroom, and when John came back and saw this interaction, John just kind of snapped. He picked up the man and basically shook him. It was such an intense reaction given the situation. I mean, it was just an innocent fan recognizing Dominique from her work. This just kind of was the first red flag of John not being able to handle Dominique's success. The next day, Dominic arrived late for lunch with Dominique and Sweeney, but was surprised that they weren't there yet. Eventually, Dominique and John showed up, and Dominic noticed that his daughter just looked really sad. She had clearly been crying, and there was just noticeable tension between her and John. The rest of the lunch was just incredibly uncomfortable. It was so awkward. John was acting very nervous at the lunch, and it was actually really hard to have an actual conversation with him. On Dominique's last night on that New York City trip, she had dinner with her brother Griffin, with her brother Alex, and with her dad Dominic. John actually had gone back to Los Angeles for work the day before, so it was just a family dinner. Dominique's brother immediately picked up on John's phoniness and was like, "Dominique, what do you see in this guy?" But Dominique said that she was happy. But Alex told Dominique they are both lying. They dislike him just as much as I do. They just don't have the balls to say so. Unfortunately, everyone's gut feelings were right. John began showing his true colors. He was becoming so possessive, jealous, and just abusive towards Dominique. John was slowly isolating Dominique and didn't want her to have any friends or any type of social life. He would actually show up to her Friday afternoon club until eventually Dominique was seeing less and less of that group. John was just so insecure about her fellow actors and actress friends blossoming careers while he was stuck working at a restaurant, struggling with his finances, and he also didn't even have a car or a driver's license. So he took out all of his frustrations and just insecurities on Dominique. He would even keep an eye on her when she'd be filming on set and just constantly thought that Dominique was flirting with the other men and lying to him. Dominique's friend and fellow actress Gloria Gifford said her and John sometimes wore the same colored outfits, and although yes, that can be seen as like cute and innocent, she feels it was John's way of showing the world that Dominique belonged to him. It also didn't help that John had a drinking problem, which often resulted in violent outbursts towards Dominique. On August 27, 1982, Dominique arrived at her mom's house at 4:30 in the morning in complete tears after a terrible fight with John. She burst crying into her mom Ellen's room, and she went under the covers with her because John had actually slammed her head against the floor several times and even pulled out chunks of her hair. So Dominique went with her mom and was crying, and John actually went looking for her, and he arrived at her mom's house banging on the door, but Ellen and Dominique just froze. They couldn't get out of bed, and they just hoped that he would leave, but he didn't. He walked to the side of the house over some bushes, and he banged on the bedroom window so hard that Ellen thought the window was going to break. Ellen threatened to call the police if he didn't leave, and John told her to mind her own business and demanded that Dominique go outside to speak with him. Ellen reached for the phone, and that scared John off. Dominique stayed with her mom for 2 days until John came by with flowers to apologize, and they made up. She begged her mom to keep quiet about this incident and to not tell anyone. Dominique swore to her mom that John would never hurt her again, so Ellen agreed. A decision she said she would later regret for the rest of her life. Unfortunately, just 4 weeks later, another violent incident occurred. This time, the only person in the family who knew was her brother Griffin. On September 26, 1982, Dominique's friends Brian and his girlfriend Denise were in town visiting from Illinois. The group spent the evening having dinner, drinks, and just catching up. Afterwards, they went back to Dominique and John's home, and while Brian and Denise settled on the sofa in the living room, they heard Dominique screaming for help from their bedroom, and they also heard sounds of choking. Brian tried to intervene and told them to stop fighting and to just like work things out in the morning, but shortly after, Brian heard Dominique's cries again, and this time noticed that there was a chair pushed up against the door to block it from opening. He tried opening up the bedroom until eventually Dominique came out, and she just was visibly shaken, and she actually had marks on her neck. Dominique managed to sneak out the bathroom window, and Brian, Denise, and John just heard Dominique's car start. John panicked, and he actually ran outside. He jumped on the hood of Dominique's car, and he was literally gripping to the car windshield wipers as she drove into the street for roughly a block or so until John was forced off the car. Dominique then drove to the home of her friend Norman Carby, who I mentioned earlier helped Dominique sell her father's belongings. I mean, she just knew that she could count on her friend Norman, and she banged on the door desperate for help. Norman opened up the door and saw that Dominique was covered in purple bruises all around her neck. He wanted to call her dad Dominic to tell him what was going on with her daughter, but Dominique just couldn't let her father know what John had done to her. Norman did end up taking photos of the bruises on Dominique's neck, and in one of the photos, she was actually smiling because Norman had made a joke about how she didn't need to get her makeup done for her shoot the next day. It was actually her first day on her new job for a show called Hill Street Blues, and she was going to be playing the role of a physical abuse victim. So he kind of just like made a joke being like, oh, well, I guess tomorrow you're not going to need to get your makeup done since you already have bruises on. Dominique smiled with a joke, but of course she was traumatized and was absolutely distraught over what John had done to her, and she just smiled because again, sometimes you just react differently to trauma. After that horrendous night where John had choked her and hurt her so terribly, Dominique just knew that she could no longer continue with this relationship. John was dangerous and she was beginning to feel scared for her life. She broke things off with John and knew that she couldn't go back to their house. She pretty much went into hiding until John moved out of their house. The only explanation she gave her dad Dominic was, "He's not in love with me, Dad. He's obsessed with me. It's driving me crazy." John was still trying to get in contact with Dominique and was asking her friends and even called one of her fellow friends / fellow actor Miguel Ferrer and accused him of having an affair with Dominique and was even like, "I know what's going on between you two and I know the truth about your affair," and was just accusing him of hiding her. And Miguel was like, he sounded insane on this phone call, like none of that was true. So at this point, John is not only harassing Dominique, but he's also harassing her friends. In mid-October, Dominique hired a locksmith to change the locks at their home, but she still felt scared because John was stalking her. He would show up unannounced at her acting classes or on her shoots, and he would even drive past her house just looking for her. Even the locksmith said that while he went to change the locks, he saw John driving by just staring at him. After finally changing the locks, Dominique ended up moving back into the home, and she sent John a letter where she wrote, quote, "I need more time. I think good thoughts about you, but I need to go slowly. I think that if we would just simply not even talk on the telephone for a while, I will only think of good things. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Given enough time alone, I'll probably beg you to come back. Please try to give me that time." But John didn't want to give her time. He begged her to take him back and even began therapy. He wanted to prove to her that he was changing. Around a month later, Dominique called Griffin with a sense of guilt, second-guessing to herself if she had been too harsh on John. Griffin was quite irritated by the sympathy that she was giving John because, I mean, he was horrendous. He was so brutal to her. A few days before this phone call with Dominique, John had actually called Griffin asking for help to reconcile with Dominique, which, I mean, the audacity to do that in the first place, like to call the brother and be like, "Oh, I know I was horrible to your sister and abused her, but like, can you help me get her back?" is insane. Griffin told him that if he ever touched his sister again, he would kill him. To this, John replied with, "If I ever did, I'd give you the gun to kill me." John was basically trying to show Griffin that he was remorseful and truly didn't mean to hurt Dominique, which to Griffin was just so transparent and insincere. Griffin just ignored this comment and shouted to stay away from Dominique before hanging up. Now, when he was on the phone with Dominique and she was feeling sorry for what she did to John, Griffin didn't want to tell her about this conversation because he didn't want her getting into her own head and thinking that perhaps John was going to change. Griffin had to end the call with Dominique before they could talk more because he was running late to go see a movie, so he told her that he would call her back the next day, but didn't. The day after that, he still didn't call Dominique back, which was actually October 30th, 1982. The day when John showed up at Dominique's house, where just 10 minutes later, his hands were once again around her throat. During the very early hours of October 31st, 1982, Detective Harold Johnston with the LA Homicide Bureau called Dominic, who was in New York City, to deliver terrible news. He told him that his daughter Dominique was near death following a violent incident and was in the hospital. Dominic said that he would take the first flight to Los Angeles, and he hung up. He then called his son Griffin, and while he made the flight reservation, Dominic packed his bags. As for Griffin and Alex, they would fly out after him. Alex didn't even have a cell phone, so Griffin rushed to his apartment and banged on his door. Alex opened the door all groggy and asked him, "What?" Griffin said that something happened to their sister Dominique, and Alex asked, "It's Sweeney, isn't it?" They landed later that day, and since it was Halloween, they were seeing kids dressed up in their costumes on their drive home. Some kids were dressed as bloody figures or had fake axes stuck in their heads. Griffin said he never imagined there would come a day where he wouldn't find those kinds of costumes amusing. However, However, while driving to see Dominique, his perspective shifted. Griffin and Alex arrived at their mom's house and saw a sign on the door that said, "We have no candy, please do not disturb." They were thinking to themselves, like, on a day where other families were trick-or-treating with their kids and having a good time, the Dunns were reuniting to see Dominique, who was violently attacked. They met with their mother inside their home, and then they all went over to the hospital to visit Dominique. As soon as they arrived at the hospital, there was already news stations camping out at the front entrance just waiting for the family. Luckily, the family entered through the back and they were able to avoid all of the paparazzi. They didn't even know what happened or like what they were walking into. Detective Johnson met them in the hospital in the waiting area, and the Dunns also noticed a man sitting in the waiting room who appeared distraught and had red eyes from crying. The family was like, "Who is that man crying? Like, does he have something to do with Dominique's incident?" And Detective Johnson explained that that was David Pecker and that he was with Dominique when John attacked her. The detective then went on to explain to the Dunn family what actually happened. The day of, Dominique had received some gifts from John at her doorstep. It was a box with a chocolate sculptured mask to resemble Dominique, some pumpkins, and some pink flowers. John was hoping Dominique would reach back out to him and want to get back together. After receiving the gift, Dominique called John at Mont Maison, and John's coworker, Michael, answered it. He passed the phone to John, and Dominique reiterated to him that their relationship has been over and will stay that way, but John begged to see her. He tried calling Dominique back over and over again, but when she didn't answer, he got very quiet and his demeanor completely changed. He reached out to his therapist and told him that he was losing control of himself and that he was just getting really upset at the fact that Dominique was ignoring him. John continued to call and call Dominique, but again, she didn't pick up the phone. As for what Dominique was doing during this time, shortly after she hung up with John and told him that their relationship was truly over, she called her friend slash actress Kit McDonough and told her that she planned to meet John for lunch the next day to talk things out. Kit questioned why she would do that, but Dominique calmed her fears and told her that everything would be fine, that John was just a little bit upset at her for not getting back together and that they were just going to talk and just clear things up. While on the phone, suddenly the phone operator interrupted, announcing an emergency call was coming in from John. Yeah, he literally managed to get the operator to interrupt Dominique's call. Kit begged her not to take the call, but Dominique decided to take it because she knew that he was going to be really upset if she ignored it. When Dominique spoke to John, he asked her if he could come over, but she said no. During their conversation, her friend and co-star David Packer arrived to rehearse a script for a mini-series that they were working on called V. He knocked on the door, and John could hear this knock through the phone call, and as soon as he heard the knock, he abruptly hung up the phone, drank 2 martinis, and told his coworker that he would be back, and then he left the restaurant. He immediately rushed over to Dominique's house, which was relatively nearby, on foot again because he didn't have a car or a driver's license, and he started knocking on her door. I think just hearing the fact that someone was knocking on her door and that it was a man freaked John out, and again, because he was so possessive and just controlling over Dominique, he just had to rush over and just make sure that another man wasn't there. Dominique opened the door with the security chain still latched, but then unlocked it to go outside to speak with John to avoid David seeing any sort of argument or altercation. David walked out and asked John if he wanted him to leave them alone to have some privacy, and John was like, "Yes, like you need to leave." But Dominique told him no, that she'd just talk to John on the front steps and then they could continue rehearsing. David was like, okay, and he locked the door behind Dominique and went back inside to rehearse his lines. However, soon after, he began hearing an altercation and then an argument. He heard thuds and he called the police. However, the police told him that Dominique's home was way out of their jurisdiction and that they couldn't go. Instead of trying to get in contact with another jurisdiction or instead of trying to get more help, David just hung up the phone, he called a friend, and he left the friend a message saying, "If I die tonight, John Sweeney did it." Then he just went back into the living room, he sat down, he put on the Poltergeist soundtrack on the vinyl player and just continued reading his lines. Maybe he did this to like not be nosy and to not hear something that he shouldn't be hearing, or just assume that Dominique would be coming back in shortly, but She never came back in the house. While John and Dominique were speaking outside, John ended up lunging at Dominique and they tumbled off the front porch and into the bushes on the side of the home, and then he began strangling her while dragging her away from the driveway to the back of the neighbor's home, which was easily accessible from Dominique's house. He was literally dragging her with his hands still around her neck. David heard Dominique screaming, and then all of a sudden it went silent. David went to look through the door's peephole but saw no one. He called the police, but again they told him to be a man, that if he could hear someone screaming and could hear an altercation, and if he knew Dominique was in trouble, he should step in and help her, which is just such an insane thing for police to say. After realizing that the police weren't coming, David exited the house from the back door to see what was going on, and in the neighbor's yard, he saw John kneeling over Dominique's body. John looked up and saw David and shouted at him to call the police, and David did so again before fleeing in fear that he could be next. As he was rushing away, he stopped at a payphone to once again call the police and to actually make sure that they were coming to Dominique's house. Now, there has been a lot of criticism towards David and his actions. Some people say that they certainly understand David's perspective and how they can imagine he was frightened and didn't know if he should step in and step over a line and intervene, and just thought that Dominique and John would work it out themselves. However, many people question David's actions and they wonder if he could have done more. If he had just intervened or just made sure that police were actually coming or had contacted someone else to help, then maybe Dominique would still be alive if he had just done things differently. I think the fact that he had called his friend and left that voicemail saying, "If I die, John Sweeney did it," just kind of shows how he knew he was in immediate danger, yet he just continued Dominique to be outside alone with John. So yeah, just a lot of people question David, and I don't blame them. So after David left the house, John tried giving CPR to Dominique, which caused her to vomit and then caused him to vomit as well. John claims he ran back into the home and consumed 2 bottles of pills, hoping that he would be dead by the time police arrived. He says he then went to Dominique's side and just waited, but police arrived before the pills could take effect. John put his hands up and told police that he killed his girlfriend and that he tried killing himself too. According to Deputy Frank D'Amelio, John said, quote, "Man, I blew it. I killed her. I didn't think I choked her that hard, but I don't know. I just kept on choking her. I just lost my temper and I blew it again." Dominique was not breathing and she had no pulse. The police performed CPR. They managed to revive her heartbeat and they rushed her to the hospital while one deputy detained John. So at the hospital waiting room, the Dunns heard all of this and they were just in complete shock. I mean, they just couldn't believe it. Griffin says they were just standing there trying to process what John had done, and they were also trying to process David's cowardice. They were thinking, what the heck? There was someone there. There was someone that could have intervened and protected Dominique, but instead that person just continued to allow her to be alone with this dangerous man and then just fled the scene. A nurse eventually approached the family and warned them to prepare themselves before they saw Dominique. She asked to verify their IDs to make sure no press were trying to pass themselves off as family, and it's horrible to think that someone would even do that. After confirming their IDs, the nurse took them into Dominique's room, and the state that she was in was incredibly difficult to see. Dominique Dunn wrote about the first time seeing his daughter in that state in his Vanity Fair article, Justice. He wrote, quote, "At first, I did not realize that the person on the bed was Dominique. There were tubes in her everywhere, and the life support system caused her to breathe in and out with a grotesque jerking movement that seemed a parody of life. Her eyes were open, massively enlarged, staring sightlessly up at the ceiling. Her beautiful hair had been shaven off. A large bolt had been screwed into her skull to relieve the pressure on her brain. Her neck was purpled and swollen. Vividly visible on it were the marks of the massive hands of the man who had strangled her. It was nearly impossible to look at her, but also impossible to look away." The first person to approach Dominique was Ellen. She took her hand and told her that her family was there with her. Then Griffin, Alex, and Dominique also approached and touched her, and they were telling her that they were there and that they loved her. The Dunns went to the hospital daily, but Dominique remained unresponsive. The doctor told them that if she did wake up, the damage would be permanent. They all knew that they would have to take her off life support, but they still held on to hope for a miracle. After all, Dominique was like an angel. She was the sweetest and just kindest person to everyone. She did nothing to deserve this, and the family wanted to believe a miracle could happen. They talked to her about all the calls from people wishing her well. Alex would read her poems. I mean, everyone was just there saying such sweet things to her, hoping that she could hear them. Now, something that really upset Dominic was the fact that the owner of Mont Maison, Patrick Terrell, told the LA Times that he would get the best lawyers for John and that he was a very dependable young man. Dominic's brother, John, and his wife, Joan, were friends with Patrick, and Patrick also knew Dominique, so the fact that he was taking John's side was unbelievable. The owner never even reached out to Dominic to offer his condolences or anything. It was also really frustrating because his brother John and Joan continued to eat at the restaurant despite the owner literally supporting Dominic's killer rather than their niece. To make matters worse, Dominic found out that Patrick had sent his brother John and Joan an orchid with a card that read, "My heart breaks for you, signed Patrick Terrell," when again, this owner hadn't even called Dominic to offer his condolences, yet he was sending that to his brother. And to make matters worse, yet again, the media was referring to Dominique as the niece of John Gregory Dunn and Joan Didion, not as a daughter of Dominic and Ellen Dunn, making it sound like Dominique was an orphan raised by her uncle and aunt. I mean, it seems like a small issue looking at the bigger picture, but Dominic just felt that he and Ellen were being denied being Dominique's parents. A Dunn family friend and former Beverly Hills mayor named Fred Leopold mentioned to the family that he actually discovered John had severely hurt another woman, a secretary at his law office, the year before. Now, when the family heard this, they were like, oh my gosh, this information could tremendously help us during the trial. So they told Detective Harold Johnson about this and he went to go follow up. Now, we'll touch on this during the trial, but this was the first time that the family had discovered that John had done this once before. Back at the hospital, the doctors explained how Dominique still had no brain activity in her scans, but for the sake of the trial, they suggested keeping Dominique on life support for just a few more days. That way, when the trial began, John's defense team wouldn't be able to argue that the hospital removed Dominique from life support too soon. The Dunn family knew a trial would happen, but they were so caught up with Dominique's state that they hadn't even processed the fact that there would be in fact a trial until that moment. 5 days after John attacked Dominique on November 4th, 1982, the Dunns gave the hospital permission to take her off life support. They each said their goodbyes privately to Dominique and had to finally accept that she wouldn't make it out of this alive. Ellen said she would like to donate Dominique's organs to the hospital. There were 2 patients awaiting kidney transplants at the same hospital, and her heart was sent to a hospital in San Francisco. Griffin says that he really hopes that the heart is still beating today. Now, let's talk about Dominique's funeral because the whole process of getting this funeral set up was just so incredibly difficult for the family, which is just something so insane to say because you think that setting up your family member's funeral should be something not easy to do. Obviously, it's not easy to bury a loved one, but the people in charge of this would try to make it as simple and smooth as possible for the victim's family. Her funeral was held at the Good Shepherd Church in Beverly Hills, and it was just extremely difficult to schedule the funeral at this specific church. Dominique wrote about how the church was known for its affluent attendees and was often called Our Lady of the Cadillacs because all the high society people in Hollywood would go to this specific church. So when Dominique went in to inquire about holding a funeral there, the Monsignor seemed unsure about having a funeral for someone who had been murdered. Dominique reminded him that they were once good members of the church and that Dominique had even been christened there by him, and that the Monsignor had even gone to their house afterwards to the reception. The Monsignor was like, wait, sorry? I don't really remember you. And Dominique was like, okay, maybe you'll remember that Martin Manulis, the producer who'd be giving the eulogy, was Dominique's godfather. Still, he had no reaction. Dominique tried again, saying that Dominique's godmother was Maria Cooper. That name caught the Monsignor's attention, and he said that he remembers Maria, daughter of Rocky and Gary Cooper, both really big actors. The Monsignor was like, okay, yeah, now I know who you guys are. Yes, we can have her funeral here. Which again is just so insane that it took Dominic having to drop celebrity names for them to hold his daughter's funeral. So they scheduled the funeral, but unfortunately there was an error in the church schedule, and Dominique's funeral overlapped with the wedding that was still not over yet. There was nothing else for the family to do but push Dominique's funeral a bit back. Griffin recalls sitting in their limo, watching a joyful couple emerge from the church as their family members showered them with rice, while they were just sitting inside their limo waiting inside to go to the funeral for one of their loved ones. It was just a horrible feeling to see people filled with so much joy while they were filled with so much sadness. When the wedding was finally over and the Dunns exited the limo, a hot gust of wind blew wedding confetti into the car, and photographers turned around and saw the family and began shouting, "There's the mother! there's the Dunn family as they all exited the limo. They entered through the back of the church where there was a ramp for Ellen's wheelchair, and Dominic told Alex and Griffin, "No matter what they say, don't say anything," referring to the press. Also, the Monsignor repeatedly mispronounced Dominique's name, which made Griffin and Alex really upset. Every once in a while, they would blurt out the correct way to pronounce it, and all of the heads would turn their way, and it was just already an incredibly difficult day, and these small oversights added to the family's frustration and grief. Every time they would say Dominique's name wrong, it just felt like an additional blow to their already shattered hearts. After the funeral was the burial at Westwood Memorial Park and Cemetery. This was the same resting place as many Hollywood figures, including Marilyn Monroe and Natalie Wood, who was actually one of Ellen's best friends and had passed away just a year before. As Dominique was lowered into the ground, the Dunn family gathered around to say their final goodbyes. They'd miss Dominique forever and just keep her in their hearts always. They now had to go back into this world without her. It was just a terribly tragic day. Dominique just had so much ahead of her. She was only 22 years old. She had such a bright future and such a beautiful career to go through, but all of it was taken away by John Thomas Sweeney. Later that night, the Dunn family watched the news coverage of John being arraigned for Dominique's murder, with his defense team by his side, and guilt settled into each of them for not voicing their true feelings about John to Dominique when there was still time to protect her. Through Dominique's friends, Dominic learned for the first time that John had assaulted his daughter just 5 weeks earlier, leading her to ending their relationship. He had no idea about this. I mean, he knew that he didn't like John and that John wasn't a good guy, but he had no idea that he was physically abusive towards his daughter. The friends told Dominic how scared she was in the last few weeks of her life. After the funeral, Dominique's best friend, Milena Bitten, was helping to clean out her house when she discovered a letter Dominique had written to John. The letter had been tucked away and forgotten, so they weren't sure if John ever even read it. It was a very emotional letter, and Dominique wrote, quote, "Selfishness works both ways. You are just as selfish as I am. We have to be two individuals to work together as a couple. I am not permitted to do my own things on my own. Why must you be a part of everything I do? Why do you want to come to my writing lessons, and why my acting classes? Why are you jealous of every scene partner I have? Why must I recount word for word everything I spoke to Dr. Black about? Why must I talk about every audition when you know it is bad luck for me? Why do we have discussions at 3 o'clock in the morning all the time instead of during the day? Why must you know the name of every person I come into contact with? You go crazy over my rehearsals. You insist on going to work with me when I have told you it makes me nervous. Your paranoia is overboard. You do not love me. You are obsessed with me. The person you think you love is not me at all. It is someone you have made up in your head. I'm the person who makes you angry, who you fight with sometimes. I think we only fight when the image of me fades away and you are faced with the real me. That's why arguments erupt out of nowhere. The whole thing has made me realize how scared I am of you, and I don't mean just physically. I'm afraid of the next time you're going to have another mood swing. When we are good, we are great, but when we are bad, we are horrendous. The bad outweighs the good." Hearing that letter just really broke your heart, and just hearing just the state of mind that Dominique was in before she passed away is heartbreaking. After the funeral, Dominic, Alex, and Griffin remained in Los Angeles for a few weeks to be there for Ellen. During that time, Ellen began to connect with a new group of friends. The day after the funeral, Ellen had received a phone call from Doris Tate, whose daughter, Sharon Tate, had also been murdered while she was 8.5 months pregnant. Doris informed Ellen that she was now part of a tragic community, the parents of murdered children, and she invited her to a meeting with the support group. Griffin went with her, and Ellen asked him to stay by her side for support during that first meeting. The group provided a space for Ellen to share her feelings with others who understood her grief. They also helped prepare Ellen for the trial, and Doris Tate told her that the trial would be the second worst experience of her life. In the courtroom, they would murder Dominique again. They would try to scrutinize her and try to blame her for her own death. It was a really scary thought for the Dunn family. Like, to think that during the trial, they would focus on the victim and focus on how her life was taken, but no. Instead, they were going to focus on ruining her reputation and ruining her image. It was just something horrible for the family to think about, because they were already grieving the loss of Dominique, and to now think about this horrendous trial that they had to go through was horrible. Dominic says in the days that followed, he and Ellen got around to watching the show that Dominique appeared in after her death. It was an episode of Hill Street Blues, which had been dedicated to her by the producers. stairs. They sat in silence watching the episode. They didn't speak, they didn't cry, they just simply stared at the screen. As I mentioned earlier, Dominique was playing an abuse victim, and when they saw her with the bruises on her face and neck, it wasn't until the trial when they learned that those bruises were real, made by John. In the days following, Ellen continued finding solace with her new group of friends in the support group and was doing a little bit better. As for Griffin, Alex, and Dominic, they decided it was time to head back to New York City. Ellen said goodbye to them and said, "Well, I guess I'll see you at the trial." Unfortunately, on the first day back in New York City, Dominic was actually mugged. It was 12 o'clock in the afternoon when he was suddenly grabbed from behind the stairs while he was coming up to the subway. In a burst of anger, he shouted as loud as he could and drew the attention of the people nearby. Although the mugger grazed him with a knife on his chin, Dominic managed to fight back and keep both his wallet and his life. He realized that despite his usual fear of confrontation at that moment, to him, the attacker represented John Sweeney, the man who had harmed his daughter. As for Griffin, in the following days, he began having a terrible and reoccurring nightmare about Dominique. A nightmare where she stood in front of Griffin screaming and where a side of her stomach was actually blown away by a shotgun. Griffin was actually envious of his brother Alex, who instead of having these horrific nightmares, had actually seen a very lovely apparition of Dominique. During this interaction, they spoke nice things to each other, and Dominique told Alex that she was okay and that he shouldn't worry about her, but that she needed him to be strong and couldn't move on unless she knew he was going to be okay. Alex had really been struggling a lot with his mental health, so maybe Dominique was checking up on him. But as for Griffin, he continued having these nightmares and he actually reached out to a psychic to kind of get some guidance. He wanted the same thing Alex got, a chance to speak with Dominique. So Griffin made an appointment under the name Tom Griffin to protect his identity and to prevent the psychic from researching him beforehand. Right away, the psychic told Griffin that he was seeing him being involved in the creative arts. He also saw something dark, something he claimed was evil. He said there was a young girl who appeared frightened, not knowing where she was, and that she wanted to get out. The psychic asked if Griffin knew who this was, and he was like, "Well, I think so." The psychic kept his eyes closed and began muttering some words until he opened his eyes and yanked his hands away from Griffin, telling him that he had hate and vengeance in his heart, and that the young girl was upset at him for it and said that she wanted him to stop planning whatever it was he was plotting. He told Griffin the young girl was so angry and couldn't leave Limbo until he removed the hate and the vengeance that he had, and that he was too angry and wouldn't allow that kind of hate in his home. The psychic escorted him out of his apartment, and Griffin was just so confused. He begged the psychic to tell the young girl that he was sorry and that he wasn't plotting anything bad. The psychic insisted that she wouldn't want to hear it and kept walking him out until he shut the door on Griffin. Griffin says this was just such a weird thing, he was trying to go to the psychic to speak to his sister and have a beautiful moment with her, but instead he was basically kicked out because his sister or whoever the psychic saw thought that Griffin was plotting something bad. Griffin says that at that moment he really wasn't plotting anything bad. The day before heading to LA to attend the trial, Dominic attended a dinner party hosted by a good friend of his, journalist Marie Brenner. Dominic had not attended any social gatherings since his daughter's death, but his dear friend Marie managed to get him out of his apartment and told him that she'd have an important guest for him to meet. That important guest was Tina Brown. Despite typically avoiding conversations about Dominique during interactions with people to honor her memory, Dominic felt drawn to share about that part of his life and his fears with Tina. He admitted that the trial really terrified him, that he didn't know anything about the legal world and was just scared of what was about to happen. During their conversation, he really liked how Tina was truly listening to him. He felt seen. Dominic says the following day, Tina invited him to lunch, but Dominic was like, "Well, I have to be on a plane in a few hours, so I don't think I can go." But Tina insisted. She told Dominic he had so many Hollywood stories and those stories should be heard. He should be writing in a magazine instead of telling all of these stories at dinner parties. She suggested Dominic keep a journal every day of Dominique's trial, and that when she became full editor of Vanity Fair, she would publish his journals. Dominic was shocked to see someone who believed in him as a writer. After the failure of the sequel he wrote, no one really believed in him, but Tina did. He called Griffin to share the exciting news, saying it had been a long time since having a sense of purpose, but that Tina gave that to him. Griffin said his father sounded the happiest he had been in a long time, but he also kind of felt conflicted by this. Yes, he was pleased for his dad, but he also felt uneasy about the idea of using Dominique's tragic story as his dad's, personal rebirth. Although he congratulated him, his enthusiasm was only half-hearted. Before the trial began, John actually attempted to take his own life in his jail cell. He was found bleeding from both of his wrists, and he left no note or told anyone. He was back to normal after 9 stitches in his left wrist and 4 in his right. As for the Dunns, before the trial began, they met with Stephen Barship, the assigned prosecutor at the Santa Monica courthouse. Stephen met with them and said it was unfortunate to meet them all under such terrible circumstances. Ellen then told him that they would be attending the trial, and Stephen kind of perked up and was like, "Why would you do that?" The Dunns were like, "Well, why wouldn't we show up to support our daughter?" And Stephen told them the same thing that Doris Tate had told Ellen a while ago, that in the courtroom, the trial could turn in on itself, meaning the blame would shift from John to Dominique. He explained how the defense would do anything to discredit Dominique, that they would bring up every little detail of her past, of her lifestyle, of her career, that they would do absolutely anything to turn the jury against her. It could even sound like Dominique was on trial instead of John. Stephen said that that would be incredibly difficult for the Dunns to hear, so he recommended them not attending the trial. Griffin wrote about this interaction in his family memoir and said that he was in disbelief that his family was being scolded for wanting to go to the trial. His brother Alex agreed, saying that the prosecutor was kind of an asshole. As for Ellen, yeah, she felt like the prosecutor was kind of like an asshole and not like the nice person, but at the same time she was like, well, don't we want someone like that fighting for Dominique? Which was true. John's defense lawyer, Michael Adelson, was very intense, so the Dunns needed someone strong up against him. Now, something that really ticked off the Dunns was that through Stephen Barship, the prosecutor, Michael Adelson had offered them a plea bargain to spare them the torturous trial. The Dunns actually accepted it for the sake of Ellen's delicate state of health, and because during the preliminary hearings for the assault charge, Dominic saw how ruthless Michael Adelson could get. But Michael later retracted this plea deal with no explanation. A few months later, however, the last weekend before the start of the jury selection, Michael approached the Dunns again with the same offer, this time through a man named Barry Farrell, who was a friend of Dominic's brother John. Barry was a journalist, and he went to the Dunn family home to deliver Michael's same offer. Dominic recalled this moment in his writing and was like, "This is confusing, why isn't Michael contacting us directly? Why is he not contacting Stephen Barship directly? Why are we being offered this plea deal through my brother's friend?" He wrote, quote, "Sweeney would plead guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter and would serve 7.5 years, but he wanted the assault charge based on his attack on Dominique 5 weeks before the murder dropped." Barry said that Adelson saw the case not as a crime but as a tragedy of a blue-collar kid who got mixed up in Beverly Hills society and couldn't handle it. Dominic was hearing this and was just getting quite upset. He knew that this was another one of Michael's tactics to get the Dunns to cause a scene. He already saw this ugly side of Michael back at the preliminary hearings, because Michael would literally greet with a "Good morning, Mr. Sweeney." Dominic would correct him, but Michael would do it again later, and Dominic thought that he was doing that on purpose to provoke an angry outburst of him out in public. What a horrible person. Why are you greeting the victim's family by being like, "Good morning, Mr. Sweeney," when you know that that's the name of the person that killed their daughter? It's just so messed up and disgusting. Barry wrapped up his meeting by reminding them that he was just a messenger, that they shouldn't get mad at him, and he thanked them for their time. So on Monday morning, the first day of jury selection, the Dunns went to Stephen's office to discuss this offer Barry presented them with. Stephen was really upset that the offer went over his head and asked them if they had accepted it, to which Dominic responded that they hadn't and wanted to consult with him first. Stephen explained that regardless, at this stage, the decision was no longer theirs to make because the state wished to proceed with the trial. Now let's talk about the jury selection. One day during this process, Dominic saw a middle-aged woman peering through the windows of the doors to courtroom D. He approached her asking where everyone was. was. She said that they all went off to lunch and that she was told they would be back in 10 minutes. Dominic said thank you, and that was that. Alex overheard this conversation and told his dad who that woman was. It was John's mother. Alex knew that because he was sitting near her in the courtroom earlier when she was informed that her son did not want to see her. Alex said her eyes filled with tears hearing this. Miss Sweeney had traveled to Los Angeles on a bus from Pennsylvania for 2 days, and her son didn't want to see her. After realizing who she was, the Dunn family would nod at her and be respectful, but they never spoke again. Dominic wrote about seeing Mrs. Sweeney every morning for the next 7 weeks and said, "We felt compassion for her and knew that she in turn felt compassion for us in the dreadful situation that interlocked our families." So jury selection was done, and the jury consisted of 9 men and 3 women. The trial officially began in the summer of 1983. The judge was Burton Katz, and he was in his 40s. He was very well groomed, he was tan, and he honestly dressed more like a Hollywood figure than a Superior Court judge. Now, this judge really frustrated me, and I'm sure he's going to frustrate you guys too. The first day of the trial, he asked a photographer from People magazine named Jim to meet him in his private chambers. Jim thought that he was going to tell him that he didn't want to be photographed or something like that, but instead, Judge Katz said that he could have his bailiff go to his house to get another pair of sunglasses for him to wear, since the ones he was wearing had a glare that would interfere with the photographs of him. It was just odd that he appeared to be treating this trial like a photo shoot or like something exciting, not a trial about the murder of a 22-year-old girl. Now, the courtroom was packed and the judge just really enjoyed engaging with the audience. He was fun, he was flirtatious with the jury, and they liked it. If Judge Katz was late, he'd apologize with like a charming excuse. One Monday, he shared stories from a weekend in Ensenada, saying he had driven with the top down and wished that they all could have come along with him on this amazing trip. The jury heard the story, they laughed, and they smiled. Again, this is a trial about the murder of a 22-year-old girl. Throughout the trial, the judge's parents would go see their son on the job, and it seemed like Judge Katz would put on a show for them. He would joke, he'd be charming, the jury would laugh at John's defense attorney, Michael Adelson, who happily joined in on the jokes about his height, which Judge Katz made. I mean, it seemed like the defense team was getting along really well with the judge, and this was all just such a weird scenario. Like, basically, right off the bat, it seemed that the judge had a bias against the Dunn family and their lawyer, Stephen, for an unknown reason. Judge Katz seemed to loathe Stephen and would overrule the majority of his objections. One of the few times that he didn't favor the defense, this happened without the jury present, was when he denied Michael Adelson's request for Ellen to be barred from the courtroom since she could gain sympathy from the jury for being in a wheelchair. Yeah, he literally wanted to ban the victim's mother from being there. Griffin wrote in his family memoir that even Judge Katz knew that this would be a bit excessive and would pile on more people outside the courtroom, calling advocate groups for people with disabilities. Just like the Monsignor at Dominique's funeral, Judge Katz was constantly mispronouncing Dominique's name, which just added to the Dunn's family's frustration. People came and went in the courtroom, lawyers from different cases had chit-chats with the clerk and also used the bailiff's phone. The microphone on the witness stand was a constant source of distraction, frequently falling over or just like screeching unexpectedly. So that's kind of the general atmosphere of the courtroom during the trial. It just seemed to lack a level of focus or seriousness, which was expected with a case like Dominique's. There were distractions and the jury was being treated with a mix of humor and tension, but regardless, the Dunns hoped that the trial would end with justice for Dominique. So let's talk about the prosecutor's opening statements. Stephen told the jury that John's obsession with Dominique led to her inevitable death at his hands. Throughout the trial, he'd present evidence and they would hear testimony that would make it crystal clear that John's crime was premeditated murder in the first degree. He also told the jury that they would hear the coroner testify that it takes between 4 to 6 minutes to die from strangulation. Now, to amplify the horror Dominique suffered, Stephen looked at his watch and told the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show you how long it took for Dominique Dunn to die." The courtroom then went silent for the next 4 minutes. It was very intense. I mean, these 4 minutes felt like forever. Dominique wrote, "It was horrifying. I had never allowed myself to think how long she had struggled in his hands, thrashing for life. It was 4 minutes that John could have stopped." Griffin wrote that he sat there haunted by the image in his head of Dominique being strangled, when all of a sudden he heard whispers between John and his defense attorney, Michael. It ruined the silence that the jury was meant to absorb. As for the defense's opening statement, they framed the case as a tragic love story. Michael said that John was a thoughtful young man who unfortunately fell into a situation he couldn't control and that his crime was not premeditated, that he only acted on his deep love for Dominique, which Dominique did not reciprocate. Basically, they were saying that John's actions were justified because Dominique wouldn't get back together with him. Every day at the trial, John walked into the courtroom with a Bible and he was dressed in all black. He kind of looked like a priest or like some type of member of the church with these outfits, and with the Bible that he would be clutching, it made him look even more like religious and innocent. Now, the crazy part is that the Bible was never actually opened. He would just bring it in to kind of use it as a prop. He would put it on the table, rest his hands on it, and that was that. John would also often cry in the courtroom, and once the court had to actually take a break because John claimed other prisoners had been harassing him and that he needed some time to gather himself. Dominic couldn't believe the jurors would actually be swayed by such an act. I mean, he saw right through it. He felt like John was just playing a character to gain sympathy and to win the case. The Dunns were seated right behind John along with various members of organizations such as Parents of Murdered Children, Women Against Violence Against Women, and Victims for Victims, and many members from the Dunn's family and friends. So thankfully the family did have a lot of support, but still it seems like their presence really annoyed Michael. At some point, Michael even had Judge Katz say, if any members of the Dunn family cries out, rolls their eyes, exclaims in any way, he will be asked to leave the courtroom. Which I understand, like sometimes you can't really cry and like make a scene because there needs to be order in the courtroom, but still to say that about a victim's family is just so disgusting. Michael even called out one day to Judge Katz, "Your Honor, Alex Dunn had tears in his eyes," and he actually tried to remove Alex and Griffin from the courtroom. Yeah, just because they had tears in their eyes, like obviously they have tears in their eyes, their sister was murdered. It was just really difficult for the Dunn family to be there. They felt like they were not welcome there and that they were like the burden when they were just family members sitting there trying to get justice for their loved one. During the trial, Griffin was actually working on a film called Johnny Dangerously, where the main character was played by Michael Keaton, a mob boss, and ironically, Griffin was a district attorney going after said mob boss. On the set, one of Griffin's fellow co-workers, who was an extra named Leo, offered him a way to make the whole thing go away. That some buddies of his he had in prison could make the trial be over by the end of the week, aka they could kill John and that would be it. Justice would be served, the trial would be done, and everyone could move on from this. Now, this was just really ironic to hear because the film was about mobsters and crime, and Griffin was thinking to himself like, wow, I'm acting this film about mobsters and I have this guy talking to me in real life how mobsters talk. And Griffin was thinking to himself like, maybe the psychic was right, because remember, the psychic had told him like, oh, you have like vengeance in your heart and this soul believes that you're going to plan something bad, and now someone was literally offering him to put a hit on John in jail. So Griffin and Alex were actually thinking about Leo's offer, but in the end, Griffin told Leo that he wasn't capable of going through with it. Another day on set, a production assistant told Griffin that David Packer, the man Dominique was with the day that she died and who had locked Dominique out of her house, stopped by Griffin's set to say hi. Griffin was furious and he shouted for David to leave, saying that they had nothing to discuss. The next day in the courtroom, David testified about what happened the night of Dominique's death. Hearing his testimony just really disgusted the family because again, they felt like he was a coward for not stepping in and saving Dominique. So the family just really did not like David, but Griffin, on the other hand, actually started to feel a little bit sorry for him after seeing him on the stand, knowing that Dominique's murder would probably haunt not only her family forever, but also David. He'd forever be burdened with regret from his lack of action that night. After David, Detective Harold Johnston went on the stand. He brought up what John had told Deputy Frank D'Amelio when they arrived on scene, that he said, quote, "He blew it again." The courtroom gasped and whispered, "Again? Like, what are you talking about?" Although the courtroom knew nothing about this, the Dunns did, because if you recall, Dominique's friend, Fred, was the one who told him about this woman whom John had severely beat, and Dominic went on to tell Detective Johnson about this. Well, Detective Johnson found this woman, and she was John's ex-girlfriend named Lillian Pierce. He interviewed her, and she said that John put her in the hospital twice, each for several days. She suffered a broken arm, a broken nose, a punctured eardrum, a collapsed lung, and and John would actually throw rocks at her anytime she would try to escape from him, and that he would also throw her down the stairs. She said John would foam at the mouth when his temper rose, and that he would smash things such as furniture and photo frames. He was very violent. With Lillian's upcoming testimony in the trial, Stephen was sure that this would be the nail in the coffin for John, but his defense attorney, Michael Adelson, requested for the jury to be removed from the courtroom for Lillian's testimony, and for some reason, Judge Katz granted this, saying that her testimony might be prejudicial. So Lillian had to testify and go into detail about all the injuries and suffering at the hands of John without the jury ever hearing it or knowing of her existence. When Stephen cross-examined her, he asked, "Let me ask you, Miss Pierce, do you come from a well-to-do family?" Michael objected this, and Stephen told the judge, "I am trying to establish a pattern." Dominic recalls how, at this moment, John lunged out of his chair. He said, quote, "We saw an enraged John Sweeney jump up from his seat at the counsel table and take off for the rear door of the courtroom, which leads to the judge's chambers in the holding cell area. Silent alarms were activated by Judge Katz. The bailiff, Paul Turner, leapt to his feet in a panther-like movement and made a lunge for Sweeney, grasping him around the chest from behind. Sobbing, Sweeney apologized to the court and said he had not been trying to escape. Judge Katz accepted his apology. He said, "We know what a strain you are under, Mr. Sweeney." Hearing that is just horrendous. The fact that John had that outburst, that he lunged, that he basically tried to escape, yet there was no punishment for that. There was no consequences. He simply just apologized to the jury, and the judge was like, "Yeah, it's understandable. I get it. You're under a lot of stress." He's under stress when he's on trial for murdering someone? That didn't even make any sense. Griffin and Alex just couldn't get that sentence out of their heads. Now, besides Lillian's, another testimony that the jury did not witness was Ellen's. Judge Katz granted Michael Adelson's request, arguing that a mother in a wheelchair on the stand during the trial for her daughter, which his client murdered, would be too prejudicial for a jury to be impartial, and Judge Katz granted him that request. Norman Carby was next to testify. His testimony really gave hope to the Dunn's family. Michael Adelson wasn't able to poke any holes in his testimony, and the jury even shed a tear when Norman addressed them. After the jury saw the photos he took of Dominique's neck that night, Norman said, quote, "Dominique was terrified that night. Make no mistake about that, but she also had, like her brothers, a sense of humor for the absurd. The irony of who she would portray the next morning made her laugh even when still in pain after her assault." Finally, a win for the Dunns and a loss for Michael Adelson. After the trial, Norman joined the Dunns for lunch at the Ivy, where Ellen told him that his testimony made her feel some hope. The family was just extremely grateful for him. However, Alex and Griffin were confused as to why their father, Dominic, chose to skip this particular lunch to thank Norman. We'll touch on this later on. Back in the courtroom, it was now John's turn to go on the stand. When he went on the stand, he was very polite and soft-spoken. He even cried. He portrayed his relationship with Dominique as nearly perfect. John acknowledged their separation and said that Dominique changed the locks on their house, but says that she promised to reconcile with him, which her refusal to do so led to the day John showed up again at Dominique's house. He claimed he couldn't even remember the murder. It was like it wasn't him doing any of it, and again said he attempted to take his own life by taking pills right after, but there was no evidence of any pill bottles found in Dominique's home, and John showed no signs of having ingested any said pills, so who knows if that's even true. So, after 7 long, very difficult weeks, the jury ultimately reached a verdict. Dominic wrote about how the courtroom was full of cameras, reporters, and photographers, and that during the verdict, it seemed like Judge Katz was like the star of the show. When he was handed the 2 envelopes, they said that he opened one very slowly and very dramatic and said nothing, as if he was in a movie opening the Grammys, or the Grammys card or something like that. So he opened it, he read the verdict, and then he handed the 2 envelopes to the clerk, Velma, so she could read the verdicts out loud. The jury found John not guilty of second-degree murder, but did find him guilty of voluntary manslaughter and of the strangulation misdemeanor for the prior incident, meaning John would only have to serve 6.5 years and could be released after 3 years for good behavior. So in the end, since John's time in jail from his arrest to his sentencing counted towards his sentence, he would actually be released in just 2.5 years. Just 2.5 years for the murder of 22-year-old Dominique Dunn. Now that the trial was over, the news of Judge Katz withholding Lillian Pierce's testimony from the jury went absolutely insane. People were furious. The jury was furious. Everyone was. They were like, wait, that information could have changed everything. If we had known that he had a violent history, this all would have been different. Judge Katz was now going under. His own daughters weren't even speaking to him. He went on to struggle in his work, and all of this made Dominic very happy. He was like, yeah, thank God. Like, this guy is horrible, and he basically ruined my daughter's chance of getting justice. The sentencing for John was on November 10th. Now, before delivering the sentence, Judge Katz suddenly changed his stance now that he was under so much public scrutiny. He said that it was his personal belief that the crime was murder, saying, quote, "I will state on the record that I believe this was a murder. I believe that Swinney is a murderer, not a manslaughter." But this new statement changed nothing. I mean, John's sentence was already what everyone knew. 6.5 years, but John would only need to serve 2.5. This was just incredibly difficult for everyone to process. I mean, John would be out in no time. He would be able to go on with his life, possibly harming another woman, while Dominique stayed frozen in time. It's just insane that Judge Katz changed his entire perspective and demeanor after receiving the public scrutiny. I have no idea why at the beginning he was just so kind of in favor of John and was like, oh yeah, I know you're under a lot of strain right now, and just felt no empathy towards the Dunn family. I really don't know what he had against them. This was just such a heartbreaking day for the Dunn family. I mean, they would never be able to see all of the wonderful milestones Dominique had ahead of her. They wouldn't be able to see her continue thriving in her career. They wouldn't be able to see her get married, to see her have children, to see her be happy. All of that was taken away from them by John. It was incredibly difficult, but Dominic says the end of the trial marked the beginning of their true healing. Before heading back to New York City, Dominic stopped by Dominique's grave. He knelt beside it and left a yellow rose for her. He told her, "Goodbye, my darling daughter." In 1984, Dominique's article titled "Justice: A Father's Account of the Trial of His Daughter's Killer" was published in Vanity Fair, and as a consequence, Judge Katz was demoted to a lower court. At great personal cost, Dominic found his voice as a writer and later began focusing on crime coverage. When John was released from prison in 1986, he went right back to working. Not at Mont Maison, however, because the restaurant had actually closed as a result of the whole trial, and because of John being employed there. John was now working at a new place called The Chronicle. Ellen actually went to go confront the manager, asking if he knew that the person cooking the food had strangled her daughter, but the owner was oblivious. I mean, he had no idea that John had done this. Shortly after, Ellen and advocacy groups picketed outside the restaurant with signs that read, "The food you are about to eat was cooked by a murderer," and John no longer worked there after this. A few months later, Griffin found out that John had landed a job in the kitchen of a well-known hotel, and coincidentally, while on a flight to Los Angeles, Griffin ended up sitting next to the hotel owner and told him about John's past. The owner had no idea, but they exchanged numbers, and the owner said that he would look into it. However, he later told Griffin that since John had marked himself as a convicted felon on his job application, they couldn't fire him without risking a lawsuit. Griffin understood and assured him that they wouldn't protest outside the hotel. After all, there was nothing they could do. However, a week later, the owner called Griffin, thrilled to report that John had punched a busboy, giving them the perfect reason to fire him. This went on at nearly all of the jobs John would get, and according to Griffin's friend, Charlie Wessler, they managed to get him fired from about 7 different places. In January of this year, TMZ did a special about Dominique Dunn, where they provided updates about John Swinney. They said that John lives now in San Rafael, California, and that he has actually been working as a general manager at a retirement community. TMZ also found him sitting outside his home, but he refused to speak to the cameras. In this special, TMZ also brought up a case from the year 2000 in Northern California, where a woman came forward saying that John was very abusive to her and that she even shared a child with him. She says that John dragged her through a hotel lobby by her ponytail, that he shoved her head into a bathtub, and also had pushed her against a wall and put his hands on her collarbone. She got a restraining order from him, but John wasn't charged with any crime. And who knows if there are more women who have suffered at his hands. I mean, he is just an extremely dangerous man, and I just truly pray that no other woman has to suffer at his hands. As for Griffin, he went on to continue acting and producing. Also, of course, one of his biggest projects was writing his family's memoir, which was published this year, which I mentioned throughout the entire video. That is where I got the majority of this information from. I highly recommend that you guys go check this out and give him so much support and so much love. Griffin ended up also having a daughter named Hannah, and when she was born, Griffin was sitting with her and he felt a presence in the room. He knew that it was his sister Dominique. Griffin said out loud, "Oh, Dominique, look what I have. Isn't she beautiful?" Which I think is just so touching. Ellen continued meeting with parents of murdered children and wanted to do her part in helping other families who have suffered similar tragedies as she had. Ellen ended up creating her own organization with two fellow friends, Marcella and Bob Leach, called Justice for Homicide Victims. Their organization aims for changes in legislation and helps families cope with the pain and assist them with navigating the legal system, something they wish that they had when they went through their own tragedies. In 1989, Ellen was actually recognized by President George H.W. Bush for her advocacy, which was a very proud moment for her. Ellen unfortunately passed away in 1997 at 64 years old, but her legacy continues through Justice for Homicide Victims. As for Dominic, he went on to continue writing novels and really focusing on covering high-profile trials such as the Menendez case and the O.J. Simpson case. Dominic was even brought up on the Netflix show Monsters, which came out this year. I already did a whole deep dive into the Menendez brothers. If you guys want to watch that, I will have that link down below. In chapter 25 of Griffin's memoir, he speaks more about his father's personal life outside of his journalism. In the spring of 2008, Griffin visited his father Dominic in Munich, Germany, where he was undergoing stem cell treatment for a tumor that was spreading through his bladder. Upon arriving at his father's hotel room, Griffin was greeted by Norman Carby, Dominique's friend, who was a key witness in her murder trial. Griffin was really caught off guard. I mean, it was kind of awkward. Like, his father was in bed looking very frail, and then Norman was just there. Dominic told him, "You remember Norman from the trial?" And Griffin was like, yeah, I suppose I do. And Dominic said nothing else about Norman's presence. He drifted into sleep, and Griffin and Norman were there in silence. Norman ordered a bottle of wine for him and Griffin to share, and they sat on the bed while Dominic was sleeping. After some small talk, Griffin was like, "Okay, I need to cut to the chase and ask what's going on. Why are you here with my dad?" Norman began explaining how he met Dominic after he helped Dominique sell his belongings all those years ago, and revealed that he and Dominic had been lovers for years, but that Dominic had kept it a secret from his entire family, from everyone besides Dominique. Griffin was like, "Wait, so my sister Dominique knew about this all those years?" And he was kind of upset at the fact that she didn't tell him or Alex, but realized that that's just how Dominique was, that she would never betray the trust of those she loved. Norman said Dominique thought that the whole thing was hilarious, how she was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm like your matchmaker, like I set you up with my dad." Griffin was now beginning to understand why his father kept his distance from Norman at the courthouse the day he testified, and why he didn't go to lunch with them all afterwards. Dominic ended up passing away in 2009 when he was 83 years old. Today, Alex and Griffin continue carrying Dominique in their hearts and hold on tightly to her spirit, to her love, and the light she brought to their lives. This was their precious baby sister, and they just loved her so much. Dominique's death was a terrible tragedy for her loved ones, but also one to everyone, to the world. You know, this was the loss of someone with so much potential. She had so much to offer the world. She was always there for her family, for her friends, even when her own life was full of challenges. Dominique wanted to make the world a better place, and she lived her life in a way that reflected that. For John to have deprived the world of all of that, of her generosity, of her kindness, of her artistry, it's infuriating and it's heartbreaking. I think Dominique's life can inspire all of us, not only to live a life we are proud of, but to do our part in raising awareness of domestic violence. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I will be leaving some resources down below if you or anyone you know is going through domestic violence or perhaps struggling with their identity. I encourage you all to check out the resources down below. My heart goes out to the Dunns, and I just hope that Dominique is resting peacefully. She just will never be forgotten. Thank you guys all so much for being here and for taking the time to listen to today's video. I know it was quite long, but I just couldn't stop writing about Dominique, and I just wanted to share as much as I could about her life, her family's life, and about everything that happened. I would love to know what you guys think about this down below. I just still cannot believe that John only served 2.5 years for taking someone's life. It is just absolutely disgusting. It's horrifying, and the fact that he's just out and about now is just terrifying to think about. So definitely let me know what you guys think about this down below. I need to go drink some tea now because my throat hurts from how much I have been speaking. But once again, thank you guys so much for being here. I think this might be my last video for like the next week or 2 weeks because my wedding is actually coming up like I'm not sure when I'm going to be posting this, but it's probably going to be coming up this week or the week after, depending on when I post this. And then afterwards, I'm going to be going on my honeymoon. So I tried to pre-film as many videos as I could, but as you can see, these videos have been getting longer and longer. So it's really difficult to film multiple of these at a time, just because these take so much research and time to film and edit and all of that. So anyways, I will definitely keep you guys posted when the next video comes, and I will see you all next time. Bye, familia.